The rain hammered against the tall glass windows of the Whitfield estate the night Daniel Whitfield came home early and found a stranger sobbing in his mother's garden, cradling an old woman's frail hand as if her own life depended on it. He had never seen the cleaning lady cry before. He had never even bothered to learn her name. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in stories that remind us what truly matters, hit that like button right now, drop a comment below, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's begin. Daniel Whitfield was 34 years old and had spent the last decade building walls instead of relationships. He ran one of the most successful architecture firms in the city, a business he had inherited from his father and multiplied threefold through sheer relentless ambition. His mother, Eleanor Whitfield, had once been the heart of their family, a warm woman who filled every room she entered with laughter, but 3 years ago a stroke had taken her ability to speak clearly and weakened her body until she needed constant care. Daniel, drowning in deadlines and boardroom battles, had hired a private caregiver and cleaning staff to manage the house while he buried himself in work, telling himself this was how he showed love, by providing, by paying for the best of everything, even though he rarely visited his mother's wing of the house himself. The cleaning lady's name was Maria Alvarez, though Daniel had never asked. She arrived every morning at 6, slipping quietly through the service entrance, and left every evening after the sun had set, her presence so unobtrusive that Daniel sometimes forgot she existed at all. She was 42 years old, with tired eyes that still held a flicker of warmth, and hands roughened by years of scrubbing floors that belonged to people who never looked her in the eye. She had been working in the Whitfield household for 8 months, hired through an agency, paid a modest wage, and treated by most of the staff as invisible furniture that happened to move and clean. Daniel passed her in hallways without a glance. He did not know that she had a daughter waiting for her at home, or that she sent half her earnings to a sister back in another city, or that she hummed old lullabies under her breath while dusting picture frames of a family that was not her own. That rainy Thursday evening, Daniel had left the office unusually early after a client meeting collapsed, and instead of going straight to his study as he always did, something pulled him toward the back garden, perhaps the strange quiet of the house, perhaps an instinct he could not name. Through the blurred glass of the conservatory door, he saw a figure kneeling on the wet stone path beside his mother's wheelchair, which had somehow been brought outside despite the rain. It was Maria, drenched to the bone, her uniform clinging to her shoulders, holding Eleanor's hand and weeping as though her heart were being torn from her chest. Eleanor, frail and silent as she had been for years, sat with her head tilted toward the sky, raindrops mixing with whatever tears she could still produce, and on her face was an expression Daniel had not seen since before the stroke, something that looked almost like peace. Daniel's first instinct was anger. He thought the cleaning lady had taken his vulnerable mother outside without permission, exposed her to the cold, perhaps even harmed her in some way he could not yet understand. He threw open the door and demanded to know what was happening, his voice sharp enough to cut through the sound of the storm. Maria flinched and tried to rise, fumbling apologies, but it was Eleanor who reacted first, gripping Maria's hand tighter and making a low, distressed sound, the kind of sound that came from somewhere deep and wordless, a sound Daniel realized with a chill was his mother trying to defend the very woman he was accusing. It took nearly 20 minutes, both women soaked and shivering, before Daniel managed to piece together what was actually happening, and even longer before he allowed himself to believe it. Maria explained, her voice trembling, that Eleanor had been agitated all afternoon, gesturing toward the garden window again and again, and that the regular caregiver, frustrated and short on patience, had simply ignored her, assuming it was meaningless confusion brought on by her condition. Maria, who had spent months quietly observing Eleanor's small gestures and learning to read them the way one learns a foreign language out of necessity and love, recognized this particular movement. Eleanor wanted to see the roses she had planted herself 30 years ago, the ones now climbing wild and unkempt along the garden wall because no one had thought to maintain that section since her illness began. Today happened to be the anniversary of her husband's death, Daniel's father, and Maria, who had found an old photograph tucked inside a drawer while dusting months earlier, a photograph of a younger Eleanor and her husband standing proudly beside those very rose bushes, had pieced together what the old woman was trying so desperately to communicate. Daniel stood frozen as Maria spoke, the rain still falling around them, because he realized with a sickening twist in his stomach that he had not known it was the anniversary of his father's death. He had not remembered. His own mother's silent grief had gone unnoticed by her own son, while a woman he paid to mop his floors had carried that weight for her, had wheeled her through a storm because she could not bear to let Eleanor sit inside aching for something only outside could offer. That night marked the beginning of something Daniel could not yet name, but it cracked something open inside him that had been sealed shut for years. He did not sleep. He sat in his father's old study, surrounded by photographs he had not looked at in ages, and he thought about every dinner he had skipped with his mother before her stroke, every phone call he had cut short, every visit he had postponed because work always seemed more urgent than love. He thought about how easily he had judged Maria without knowing a single true thing about her, how he had looked at her for 8 months and seen only a uniform, only a function, never a person with a heart big enough to grieve alongside a stranger's mother as if she were her own. The next morning, Daniel found Maria in the kitchen earlier than usual, preparing Eleanor's breakfast with a gentleness he had never noticed before, speaking softly to his mother even though Eleanor could not respond in words, narrating the weather outside, the color of the sky, small kindnesses stitched into ordinary moments. He stood in the doorway for a long while before she noticed him, and when she did, her body stiffened, bracing for reprimand, for the kind of cold dismissal she had likely received from people like him before. Instead, Daniel asked if he could sit with them. Maria's surprise was evident, but she nodded, and for the first time in years, Daniel Whitfield ate breakfast in his mother's wing of the house, sitting at her side while Maria gently guided a spoon to Eleanor's lips, occasionally catching Daniel's eye with a flicker of something between caution and quiet hope. Over the following weeks, Daniel began arriving home earlier, not out of obligation but out of a hunger he had not realized he carried, a hunger to know his mother again before it was too late, and to understand the world of the woman who had quietly become her closest companion. He learned that Maria had once trained as a nurse in her home country before circumstances forced her to leave everything behind, that her qualifications had not transferred, that she had taken cleaning work because it was the only job available that paid enough to support her daughter, a bright 12-year-old girl named Sophia who dreamed of becoming a doctor. He learned that Maria often skipped her own lunch to spend extra unpaid time with Eleanor, reading to her from worn paperback novels, playing old records because music seemed to reach Eleanor in places words no longer could. He learned that the other household staff sometimes mocked Maria behind her back, calling her foolish for caring so much about a job that paid so little, but Maria had simply told them that some things mattered more than money, that Eleanor reminded her of her own mother who had passed away alone in a hospital while Maria worked 3 jobs trying to keep them afloat, unable to be at her bedside in her final hours. This revelation struck something raw in Daniel. He began to see his own privilege reflected back at him through Maria's quiet sacrifices. The ease with which he had assumed his wealth made him generous, when in truth his money had only ever bought distance, hiring people to do the loving so he would not have to. He started spending his evenings differently, sitting beside his mother, holding her hand the way Maria did, learning the language of her small gestures, the way her eyes would brighten faintly at certain songs, the way her fingers would twitch with what he now understood was an attempt at communication. Slowly, painstakingly, father and mother and son began to reconnect through Eleanor's altered world, and Maria became not just an employee but something closer to family, a bridge between Daniel and the mother he had nearly lost without ever truly knowing. But life, as it often does, was not finished testing them. 2 months after that rainy night in the garden, Maria did not show up for work. She did not call. This was so unlike her that Daniel felt a cold unease settle into his chest from the moment he noticed her absence. He called the agency that had placed her, only to learn that Maria had been let go from their roster after a complaint was filed against her, a complaint from another household staff member who claimed Maria had been stealing small items from the Whitfield estate. Daniel's mind reeled. He thought immediately of Eleanor's old jewelry box, of silver picture frames, of how easy it would be to dismiss a poor housekeeper as a thief without ever questioning whether the accusation held any truth. He drove to the address listed in Maria's employment file, a modest apartment on the other side of the city, the kind of neighborhood Daniel had never once set foot in despite living only 20 minutes away his entire life. He found Maria sitting on the steps outside her building, her eyes swollen from crying, Sophia beside her looking frightened and confused. When Maria saw him, she stood quickly, assuming he had come to confirm her dismissal, to add his voice to the accusation, and she began apologizing for something Daniel was almost certain she had not done, the desperate apology of someone who had learned that the world rarely believed people like her. Daniel told her, with a firmness that surprised even himself, that he did not believe she had stolen anything, and that he intended to find out the truth. He spent the next several days investigating quietly, reviewing security footage from the estate, speaking with other staff members individually instead of accepting second-hand gossip. What he discovered shattered his remaining illusions about the people he had trusted without question. The actual thief was a long-time member of the household staff, a woman who had worked for the Whitfield family for over a decade and had grown resentful watching Eleanor's clear favoritism toward Maria develop over recent months. She had taken several small valuable items and, fearing discovery, had fabricated the complaint against Maria to deflect suspicion, counting on the fact that no one would think to question the word of a longtime employee over a recently hired cleaning woman with an accent and a modest background. When Daniel confronted her with the evidence, she confessed almost immediately, and he terminated her employment on the spot, something that would have been unthinkable for him to do with such conviction just a few months earlier, back when he avoided confrontation and outsourced every difficult decision regarding the household to people he barely supervised. He drove back to Maria's apartment that same evening, evidence in hand, an apology already forming in his chest before he even reached her door. When she opened it and saw the truth in his eyes, the relief that swept across her face was so profound, so raw, that Daniel found himself struggling to hold back his own tears, something he had not done in front of another person since his father's funeral. He asked her to come back, not just as a cleaner, but to formally take on the role of his mother's primary caregiver, with a salary that reflected the depth of skill and devotion she had shown for months without ever being asked, and with full support for Sophia's education. An opportunity Daniel insisted was the very least he could offer given everything Maria had quietly given his family without expecting anything in return. Maria wept again that evening, but this time the tears were different, tears of disbelief that kindness like this still existed in a world that had taught her otherwise, tears of a mother finally allowed to dream bigger for her daughter's future. In the months that followed, the Whitfield estate transformed into something it had not been in years, a place filled with warmth instead of cold efficiency. Eleanor's health did not miraculously improve, her body remained fragile, her voice remained mostly silent, but something in her eyes grew brighter, fuller, as if she finally felt surrounded by people who saw her, who loved her, rather than people who simply managed her existence. Daniel began bringing Sophia along on weekends, and the bright young girl would sit beside Eleanor reading her science textbooks aloud, dreaming her dreams of becoming a doctor within earshot of a woman who, despite everything, would occasionally squeeze her hand in what felt unmistakably like encouragement. Daniel funded a scholarship in his father's name specifically for children of caregivers and domestic workers, inspired entirely by Sophia's quiet determination and Maria's sacrifice, ensuring that other families would not have to choose between survival and a child's future the way Maria once had. If this story has touched your heart even a little, if it reminded you that the people we overlook every day often carry the deepest kindness within them, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and leave a comment letting me know which part moved you most. Your support means more than you know, and it helps stories like this one reach more hearts that need them. Before we close, I want to ask you something important. Comment below the word kindness if you believe that even the smallest, quietest acts of love can change someone's entire life, the way Maria's love changed the Whitfield family forever. Eleanor passed away peacefully 18 months later, surrounded not by hired strangers but by people who had become her true family, Daniel holding one hand and Maria holding the other, with Sophia softly playing one of Eleanor's favorite old records in the background. At the funeral, Daniel stood to speak, and instead of a polished eulogy about his mother's accomplishments, he spoke instead about the woman who had taught him how to truly see her, the cleaning lady he had once walked past without a glance, the woman who knelt in the rain holding his mother's hand when he himself had been too consumed by his own life to notice his mother's silent grief. He spoke about how the smallest acts, a held hand, a recognized gesture, a moment of patience, often mattered more than any fortune he had ever built, and how it took losing sight of what truly mattered to finally understand that the people society teaches us to overlook are often the very ones capable of saving us. Maria stood quietly in the crowd that day, no longer invisible, no longer unseen, but standing as family, as the woman who had walked into the Whitfield house as a stranger hired to clean floors and walked out as the person who had taught its last remaining son how to love again before it was too late.